Welcome back to the channel. Tonight, we delve into a story that strips away the comfortable safety of the screen you're staring at. We often consume true crime as a form of dark entertainment, a puzzle to be solved from the safety of a locked home. But what happens when the investigator crosses the line and the observer becomes the hunted? Our subject is Elias Thorne. Elias was a man who made his living mocking the dark. A true crime podcaster with a massive online following, he possessed that dangerous blend of arrogant skepticism and insatiable ambition. To Elias, human tragedy was just content. Unsolved brutal murders were mere audio metrics. And he had his sights set on the crown jewel of Midwestern macabre, the Miller farmhouse. Nestled at the end of a dead-end dirt road in a forgotten, dust-choked rural town, the house was a grim anomaly. In the sweltering summer of 1912, it had been the site of a massacre so brutal it shattered the community forever. An entire family butchered in their beds while they slept. The weapon, a heavy iron-headed axe, was never found. The killer simply vanished into the cornfields, leaving behind only blood-soaked floorboards and a deeply unsettling mystery. Every single mirror in the house had been meticulously draped with heavy dark cloth by the murderer before they fled. Over a century later, the house remained exactly as it was, untouched, unsold, unforgiving. Elias arrived on a suffocatingly hot Friday afternoon in late August. The air outside was thick, smelling of dry dirt and impending storms, but the house itself emanated a strange, sour chill. He was met on the sagging porch by Mr. Abernathy, the current property caretaker, a frail, nervous man who firmly refused to step past the threshold. "You're entirely sure about this?" Abernathy asked, his eyes darting nervously toward the darkened front windows. He clutched a heavy ring of iron keys, his knuckles white. Elias merely chuckled, adjusting the strap of his heavy pelican case. "It's just old wood and bad memories, man. Nothing a good microphone can't handle. Just make sure you're back here at 7 a.m. sharp to unlock the door." What Elias didn't know, what his arrogant skepticism completely blinded him to, was that houses like this are never truly empty. They are vessels. They hold on to violence, preserving it like a parasite caught in amber. And sometimes, if you sit quietly enough in the dark, that violence wakes up. Abernathy didn't argue. He seemed desperately eager to put miles between himself and the property before the sun dipped below the tree line. He handed Elias a single emergency key, thick, rusted, and unwieldy, and pulled the heavy oak front door shut. From the inside, Elias stood in the suffocating silence of the foyer. The air was stagnant, smelling sharply of old pine, decaying wallpaper, and a faint metallic tang, like copper pennies left out in the sun. He watched through the warped, wavy glass of the door as Abernathy fumbled with the exterior padlock. Clack! The heavy metallic thud of the deadbolt sliding into place echoed through the empty corridors like a gunshot. It was a dreadful, final sound. Elias was locked in. He turned around, his flashlight beam piercing the gloom. The hallway stretched out before him, leading toward the steep, impossibly narrow wooden staircase that spiraled up into the pitch-black second floor. Along the walls, the covered mirrors hung like shrouded corpses, their dark, heavy cloths perfectly still. Elias hit record on his primary audio deck. "All right," he whispered to his audience, his voice swallowed instantly by the oppressive, dead acoustics of the house. "I'm locked in. Let's see what ghosts we can find." But the house wasn't interested in giving him ghosts. As Elias took his very first step toward the stairs, a slow, deliberate creak sounded from the ceiling above. It came directly from the sweltering, claustrophobic space of the attic. He froze. The heavy oak door behind him was locked from the outside. and he was already no longer alone. The single, agonizing creak from the ceiling seemed to hang in the stagnant air for an eternity. Elias stood frozen at the foot of the narrow staircase, the beam of his flashlight trembling just a fraction against the peeling wallpaper. His breath caught in his throat. He listened, straining his ears against the crushing silence of the farmhouse. Nothing followed, just the frantic thudding rhythm of his own pulse. "Thermal expansion," Elias whispered, though his voice lacked its usual arrogant bite. He cleared his throat, directing his voice toward the glowing red indicator of his audio deck. "The house is old. Wood warps and contracts, especially as the brutal daytime heat starts to dissipate. Perfectly natural." It was a lie, of course, a necessary fiction to keep his creeping paranoia at bay. He shook off the unease, adjusting the heavy pelican case on his shoulder, and turned away from the stairs. He needed a central hub for his equipment, and the parlor at the end of the hall seemed like the ideal spot to set up camp. The parlor was a suffocating time capsule. Faded floral furniture sat arranged around a soot-stained fireplace, the fabric brittle and smelling of deep, undisturbed rot. Dominating the room, mounted directly above the mantel, was a massive antique mirror. Like every other reflective surface in the Miller house, it was concealed behind a thick, light-swallowing shroud of black velvet. The material looked incredibly heavy, yet surprisingly free of dust. Elias unpacked his gear methodically. He mounted a pair of ultra-sensitive binaural microphones on a tripod in the center of the room, running thick cables back to his primary recorder on a dusty clawfoot coffee table. He intended to capture the dead air of the room, the baseline acoustic signature of the murder site. But the silence in the Miller house wasn't just dead air. What Elias couldn't yet comprehend was that the silence here was a physical weight. It pressed against the eardrums, thick and suffocating. It wasn't an absence of noise, it was a predatory stillness, waiting patiently for the intruder to expose himself. As Elias slipped his heavy monitoring headphones over his ears to test the levels, a sudden, inexplicable sensation washed over him. The oppressive, oven-like heat of the parlor fractured. A distinct freezing draft coiled around his ankles and slithered up the back of his neck. The hairs on his arms stood on end. He yanked the headphones off, spinning around. The beam of his flashlight sliced through the darkness, hitting the boarded-up windows. Heavy iron nails held thick planks of rotting wood firmly in place over the wavy glass. There were no gaps, no broken panes. The air in the house had been sealed and stagnant for decades. There was absolutely no physical reason for a draft. Elias slowly backed away from the windows, his eyes darting around the parlor. That was when he noticed it. The heavy black velvet cloth draped over the mantel mirror was gently swaying. It wasn't a violent movement, but a slow, rhythmic undulation, as if the fabric were breathing. Elias swallowed hard, raising his camera to document the anomaly. He took a hesitant step toward the fireplace. Then he heard it. Through the thick, soundproof padding of his headphones resting around his neck, the ultra-sensitive microphones picked up a sound that the naked eye could barely detect. He quickly pulled the headphones back over his ears and cranked the gain dial. Tap. A pause of 3 agonizing seconds. Tap. Another pause. Tap. It was faint, rhythmic, and entirely deliberate, and it wasn't coming from the parlor. Elias tilted his head upward, his blood running cold. The sound was bleeding straight through the ceiling plaster. It was coming from the attic, and it sounded exactly like a heavy metallic object being gently, methodically tapped against the floorboards. Before Elias could even process the horrifying implication of the rhythm, the heavy black velvet cloth draped over the mantel mirror violently detached from its centuries-old pins. It collapsed to the floor in a heavy, dusty heap, exposing the tarnished, black-spotted glass beneath and whatever might be reflected in it. The sudden, violent collapse of the heavy velvet cloth sent a thick cloud of century-old dust billowing into the stagnant air of the parlor. Elias flinched, instinctively raising an arm to shield his face. In his heavy monitoring headphones, the faint, rhythmic metallic tapping from the attic abruptly ceased. The sudden absence of sound left behind a ringing, oppressive silence that felt infinitely heavier than before. Through the settling dust, the exposed mirror loomed over the soot-stained mantel. Elias didn't want to look. Every primal instinct, honed by thousands of years of human evolution, screamed at him to keep his eyes averted from the glass. But the stubborn ambition that had built his career demanded he document the moment. He raised his flashlight. The sharp beam cut through the gloom, striking the antique mirror. There were no ghouls waiting in the reflection, no cheap, ghostly figures standing just over his shoulder. It was just a warped, mercury-backed piece of glass, reflecting the decaying parlor and his own pale, rigid face. Yet the reflection itself was profoundly unsettling. The deep, black tarnished spots bleeding across the glass made the room look diseased, as if the house were rotting from the inside out. Elias stepped closer, panning his camera down to the heavy cloth pooled on the floorboards. He knelt, his fingers brushing against the thick, dark velvet. It was absurdly heavy, like a lead apron. He shone his light up at the ornate wooden frame of the mirror, inspecting the hardware. The thick iron pins that had held the shroud in place for over a century hadn't rusted through. They hadn't snapped under the weight of the fabric. They had been bent downward, symmetrically, as if something with immense, deliberate strength had gripped the top of the heavy cloth and ripped it straight toward the floor. "Okay," Elias breathed, his voice trembling slightly as he narrated into his lapel mic. "The covering just fell. The pins are bent. Maybe the sheer weight of the fabric over time, combined with the sudden temperature shift in the room. It's the only logical explanation." What Elias was doing is what we all do when confronted with the impossible. We build a fragile fortress of logic to hide from the terrifying truth. He wasn't dealing with gravity or thermodynamics. The house was systematically stripping away his psychological defenses, isolating him, reminding him that he was not the one in control. Desperate to regain a sense of authority over his environment, Elias left the parlor and ventured down the narrow hallway toward the kitchen. He needed to plant his secondary audio recorders to triangulate any further anomalies. The kitchen was a nightmare of rusted iron and dry-rotted wood. The air here was sweltering again, the sudden freezing draft from the parlor entirely absent. It smelled thickly of metallic dust, dried earth, and old copper. He placed a small digital recorder on the cracked butcher block island, aiming the microphone straight up. The floorboards directly above the kitchen belonged to the upstairs hallway, leading straight from the attic door to the main staircase. He hit record, slipped his heavy monitoring headphones back on, and plugged his receiver into the secondary unit to check the levels. For a few seconds, there was only the low, static hiss of the room's dead air. Then, the silence broke. It wasn't the faint metallic tapping from before. This sound was continuous. Through the thick padding of the headphones, Elias heard a low, agonizing scrape echoing directly through the plaster above his head. Shk, shk, shk. It was the distinct sound of dead weight being dragged across the second-floor floorboards. Slow, deliberate, and impossibly heavy. And as Elias stood paralyzed in the sweltering heat of the kitchen, staring up at the cracked ceiling, he realized the dragging sound was moving. It was creeping out of the attic hallway and heading directly for the top of the impossibly narrow wooden stairs.
The dragging sound overhead, shk, shk, was an undeniable physical reality bleeding through the ceiling of the sweltering kitchen. Elias ripped his heavy monitoring headphones off, letting them clatter against the butcher block island. The raw acoustic sound in the room was fainter, but it was there. It wasn't just in the ultra-sensitive microphones anymore. It was vibrating through the ancient timber of the farmhouse. What Elias should have done in that exact moment was hurl his heavy flashlight through the boarded-up window, shatter the glass, tear at the rotting wood, and crawl out into the stifling August night. But pride is a heavy anchor, and Elias had built an empire on proving the dark was empty. He desperately convinced himself it was an animal, a raccoon dragging a carcass, a heavy tree branch scraping the roof. The lies we tell ourselves in the dark are always the most dangerous ones. He drew a shuddering breath, gripped his primary flashlight until his knuckles turned white, and unholstered a smaller backup camera from his belt. Slowly, he crept out of the kitchen and back into the main hallway. The air here felt thicker, practically swimming with that metallic tang of old copper. He angled his beam toward the base of the main staircase. The steps were impossibly steep and narrow, a treacherous wooden spine leading up into the suffocating blackness of the second floor. At the very top, the darkness was absolute, swallowing the beam of his high-powered flashlight completely. Elias stood at the bottom step, his chest heaving, his camera recording every terrified tremor of his hand. He held his breath, straining to hear. The dragging had stopped. The house had plunged back into that predatory, suffocating silence. "Hello?" Elias called out. His voice cracked, stripping away any illusion of control. It sounded pathetic, entirely swallowed by the dead acoustics of the hallway. "I'm armed. I know someone is up there." He wasn't armed. It was a desperate bluff tossed into the pitch-black maw of the second floor, and the house answered his bluff. From the landing above, hidden just out of sight in the sweltering shadows, came a distinct metallic clink. It wasn't a scrape or a subtle tap. It was the sharp sound of iron striking wood. Elias took a reflexive step back. A heavy, rusted object tumbled over the edge of the top stair. Thud, thud, thud. It bounded down the steep wooden staircase, gaining momentum, the sound echoing like gunshots in the quiet house. Elias tracked it with his flashlight as it hit the final step, skipped across the scuffed floorboards of the hallway, and came to a dead stop mere inches from the toe of his boot. Elias lowered the beam. Lying on the dusty floor was a massive hand-forged iron nail, the kind used to board up windows, the kind used to seal doors. It was heavily pitted with age, and its thick, blunt tip was coated in a dark, flaky substance that looked disturbingly like dried earth. A freezing chill shot down Elias's spine, completely overriding the oven-like heat of the hallway. That nail hadn't fallen. The angle was impossible. It had been tossed, deliberately. He raised the flashlight back up the stairs. For a fraction of a second, just before the beam lost its fight against the darkness at the top landing, Elias's camera caught something. Not a ghost, not an apparition. The undeniable physical shift of a massive, solid shape retreating silently into the shadows of the upstairs hallway. The horrifying truth finally hit him, shattering his arrogant skepticism into a million irreparable pieces. This wasn't a haunting. The intruder hadn't broken in while Elias was setting up his gear. They had been hiding up there in the claustrophobic attic the entire time. They had been patiently waiting for the caretaker to leave, and Mr. Abernathy had just locked them both inside. Before Elias could pivot to run back to the parlor to grab his emergency key, the heavy-duty portable battery station powering his localized equipment let out a sharp, dying electronic wail. Click. The faint ambient glow of the recording equipment spilling from the adjacent rooms abruptly vanished, plunging the first floor of the Miller house into absolute, suffocating darkness.
Have you ever experienced true, absolute darkness? I don't mean turning off the lamp in your bedroom where the ambient glow of streetlights still bleeds through the gaps in the blinds. I mean the kind of suffocating pitch-black void that exists only in subterranean caves or forgotten, boarded-up houses. In this kind of dark, your brain panics. Stripped of visual input, it begins to manufacture terrifying shapes out of the static. When Elias's power station died, swallowing the faint LED glows of his equipment, his world shrank instantly to the narrow, trembling cone of his practical flashlight. He stood, paralyzed, at the bottom of the staircase. The heavy iron nail lay just inches from his boots. He didn't breathe. He didn't blink. He just stared up the steep wooden incline into the absolute void. Then the top stair screamed. It wasn't a floorboard casually settling. It was the agonizing, prolonged groan of century-old pine splintering under an immense sudden weight. Something incredibly heavy had just stepped onto the top landing. Elias's throat tightened. He gripped the heavy metal casing of his flashlight like a weapon, the beam jerking wildly as his hands shook. "Who's up there?" he demanded. His voice was no longer the confident, booming baritone of a seasoned broadcaster. It was a raw, terrified rasp. The intruder didn't answer with words. They answered with another step. Creak. And then came the sound that would forever haunt the final corrupted audio files of Elias Thorne. Following the heavy footfall, there was a dull, metallic clack, followed immediately by a horrific shk, shk, scraping against the wood. It was the sound of something solid and iron-heavy being dragged down to the next step. Step, clack, drag. Step, clack, drag. It was a methodical, unhurried rhythm. The predator wasn't charging. It didn't need to. It knew exactly where Elias was, and it knew that the heavy oak front door was padlocked from the outside. Panic, raw and blinding, finally severed Elias's paralysis. The emergency key, the thick, rusted key Abernathy had handed him, was zipped inside the front pocket of his Pelican case, sitting uselessly on the coffee table in the parlor. To get it, he had to turn his back on the stairs. He began to back away slowly, his boots shuffling blindly over the uneven floorboards of the hallway. He kept the flashlight beam pinned to the base of the stairs, terrified that if he looked away for even a second, the heavy, descending shape would suddenly rush him from the dark. The air in the hallway shifted drastically as he retreated. The stagnant, dusty odor was violently replaced by an overpowering, sickening wave of raw copper and old, sour sweat. It was a deeply human smell, primal and violent. Elias backed into the parlor doorframe, the rotting wood jarring his shoulder. He couldn't wait any longer. He whipped around, casting the flashlight beam frantically around the room. The binaural microphones stood like silent skeletons in the center. The heavy black velvet cloth still lay in a crumpled heap beneath the exposed tarnished mirror. He lunged for the coffee table, his hands frantically tearing at the heavy zippers of the Pelican case. His breathing was ragged, echoing loudly in the suffocating silence of the room. He shoved aside spare batteries, tangled XLR cables, and lens caps, his fingers desperately seeking cold iron. Back in the hallway, the dreadful rhythm continued. Step, clack, drag. It was getting louder, closer. The vibrations of the heavy footfalls were now traveling through the floorboards, buzzing against the soles of Elias's boots. He found the pocket. He ripped it open, his fingers closing around the thick, heavy teeth of the emergency key. A sob of pure relief caught in his throat. He turned, aiming the flashlight back toward the open parlor doorway, ready to make a mad dash for the front entrance. But he froze. The rhythmic stepping had stopped. The house was dead silent once more. Elias held the beam steady on the empty hallway outside the parlor. Dust motes danced in the stark, blinding light. He realized with a sickening jolt of pure terror why the steps had ceased. The intruder hadn't moved down. They'd reached the bottom of the stairs. They were standing somewhere out there in the pitch-black hallway, just inches outside the reach of his light, waiting patiently for Elias to step out of the parlor. The silence in the Miller house was no longer empty. It was coiled, tight as a snare wire, vibrating with the horrifying certainty of a predator waiting for its prey. Elias stood rigidly in the parlor, the thick, rusted emergency key biting sharply into the damp palm of his hand. His flashlight beam cut a stark, trembling circle onto the faded wallpaper of the hallway just beyond the parlor doorframe. To understand Elias's precise nightmare, you have to picture the brutal geometry of the house. The parlor sat at the end of a long, narrow corridor.
To reach the heavy oak front door and the padlock that separated him from the sweltering August night, Elias had to walk that entire length. He had to walk directly past the base of the narrow wooden staircase, exactly where the dragging footsteps had just stopped. He swallowed hard, tasting sour copper in the back of his throat. His chest heaved in the suffocating, oven-like heat, his breaths sounding deafeningly loud against the quiet. He couldn't stay in the parlor. There were no exits, only boarded-up windows sealed with thick, hand-forged iron nails. "Okay," Elias whispered, the word barely a rasp. "Just go. Just run." He took a step toward the doorway. The floorboards under the faded carpet shrieked. From the pitch-black void of the hallway there was a sudden wet shift. It sounded like heavy, damp fabric sliding against the wood. The smell of old, sour sweat and raw earth hit Elias with the force of a physical blow, making him gag. He thrust the flashlight forward, stepping out of the parlor and sweeping the beam frantically across the corridor. For a fraction of a second, the harsh white light caught it. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a trick of the mind. Standing just beyond the base of the stairs, pressed tightly against the wall where the covered mirrors hung, was a colossal, ragged silhouette. It wore layers of dark, filthy clothing that looked like they had been buried and dug back up. But it was the hands, or rather, what was in them, that made Elias's blood run entirely cold. Hanging from a thick, leather-clad grip, resting heavily against the scuffed floorboards, was the dull, rusted wedge of a massive iron axe. The beam of the flashlight trembled violently, sliding off the horrific shape for just a millisecond. In that infinitesimal window of darkness, the entity moved. It didn't step carefully this time. It lunged forward with a sudden, terrifying kinetic violence. Clack, drag. The heavy iron head of the axe douged a deep, splintering trench into the wooden floor as the figure swung it forward, using the immense weight to propel itself down the narrow hallway towards Elias. Pure, unadulterated adrenaline flooded Elias's system. He didn't scream. There was no air left in his lungs for it. He bolted. He threw himself blindly down the corridor, aiming the beam of his flashlight directly at the warped, wavy glass of the front door. The beam bounced chaotically with every desperate stride, casting dizzying shadows against the walls. Behind him, the agonizing shick, shick of the dragging iron accelerated into a deafening, rhythmic roar. The house itself seemed to vibrate with the sheer, crushing weight of his pursuer. Elias slammed shoulder first into the heavy oak door, the impact sending a jarring shockwave down his spine. He fumbled frantically with the thick emergency key, his trembling fingers desperately trying to align it with the rusted keyhole of the interior padlock. Clack, drag. The sound was deafening now. The sour, metallic smell of the attacker was suffocatingly close, practically breathing down his neck. Elias shoved the key into the lock and twisted with all his might. The ancient mechanism seized. It wouldn't turn. In his blind panic, his sweaty grip slipped from the smooth metal casing of his flashlight. It tumbled from his hand, hitting the floorboards with a sharp crack, the glass lens shattering instantly. The bulb flickered, hissed, and died. Absolute, suffocating darkness swallowed the foyer, leaving Elias blind, trapped against the locked door as the heavy drag of iron stopped just inches from his heels. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was a physical, suffocating entity. It poured into the foyer, filling Elias's throat, pressing against his dilated pupils until his mind began to conjure swirling, phantom shapes. Without the sharp beam of his flashlight, the world vanished entirely, leaving only raw, terrifying sensory input. He was pinned against the warped oak of the front door, his fingers slipping blindly against the rusted emergency key that remained hopelessly jammed in the padlock. Less than an arm's length away, the hulking mass waited. Elias couldn't see it, but he could feel the heavy, oppressive radiation of its presence in the sweltering heat. The smell was vile, a sickening cocktail of raw copper, wet earth, and sour, ancient sweat that made Elias's stomach violently heave. Then he heard the breathing. It was a wet, rattling rasp, laboring deep within a massive chest, sounding like a rusted bellows pumping thick fluid. It was methodical, unhurried, and dripping with cruel anticipation. A dreadful, agonizing creak of thick leather echoed in the cramped foyer. The heavy iron head of the axe scraped a final sickening time against the floorboards before the sound lifted into the air. The entity was raising the weapon. In the pitch black, Elias had no visual cue, no warning glint of metal. He had only the terrifying, sweeping whoosh of displaced air descending toward his skull. Primal survival instinct violently hijacked his frozen limbs. Elias didn't try to pull the jammed key free. He abandoned his only exit, throwing his entire body weight sideways and diving blindly into the black void of the adjoining corridor. Thwack! Crack! A deafening, explosive splintering of ancient wood erupted exactly where Elias's chest had been a fraction of a second prior. The sheer kinetic force of the axe cleaving into the solid oak bore sent a violent shudder through the floorboards, rattling Elias's teeth as he hit the ground hard. He scrambled frantically on his hands and knees, his palms tearing against exposed nail heads and rough splinters. The farmhouse was a pitch-black labyrinth now. He was navigating purely by terrified memory, completely blind. He crawled like a wounded animal, his shoulder violently clipping a sharp wooden doorframe. The dining room. He remembered the layout from his initial sweep while setting up his gear. He dragged himself over the threshold and scrambled behind a massive, heavy mahogany table that sat in the center of the room. The air in here was sweltering, an oven-like trap of stagnant heat that immediately slicked Elias's skin with a freezing sweat. He pulled his knees tightly to his chest, burying his face in his arms and clamping both hands brutally over his mouth. He had to silence his own ragged, hyperventilating gasps. If he made even the slightest sound, he was dead. Out in the foyer, an agonizing, woody shriek tore through the silence as the killer forcefully wrenched the heavy iron axe free from the splintered oak door. Then the dreadful rhythm returned. Step, clack, drag. But the pace had fundamentally changed. It was no longer a frenzied, violent charge. It was a meticulous, patient stalk. The predator knew its prey was trapped inside the locked box of the house, swallowed by the dark. The heavy footsteps moved away from the front door, the iron axe head softly grazing the wooden floorboards with a sickening, continuous shh, shh. Elias squeezed his eyes shut in the dark, hot tears of pure, unadulterated terror leaking down his cheeks. The dreadful dragging sound paused. It was right outside the dining room threshold. The wet, rattling breathing filled the suffocating silence, thick and heavy. Elias stopped breathing entirely, his lungs burning. Then, slowly, the agonizing scrape of iron crossed the threshold, moving deliberately across the dining room floorboards, heading directly for the heavy mahogany table where Elias hid.
Have you ever tried to silence your own heartbeat? It is a biological impossibility. When the body believes it is about to die, the heart becomes a deafening drum, pumping adrenaline to muscles screaming to run. For Elias, curled tightly beneath the massive mahogany dining table, that internal drumbeat felt loud enough to shake the floorboards. The pitch-black dining room was an oven of stagnant, suffocating heat. Elias squeezed his eyes shut, a useless gesture in the absolute dark, and clamped his sweaty palms over his mouth and nose. He was terrifyingly exposed. The table offered no physical protection against a heavy iron axe. It merely broke the line of sight that neither of them currently possessed. Step. Clack. Drag. The intruder moved with an agonizing, predatory sluggishness. The heavy, wet scrape of the iron axe head against the hardwood sounded less like a weapon and more like a massive pendulum counting down Elias's final seconds. The smell hit him again, a violently physical wave of sour sweat, wet earth, and raw copper. It was so thick it coated the back of Elias's throat. The floorboards groaned directly in front of the table. The dragging stopped. Through the silence, Elias heard that wet, rattling respiration again. It was directly above him. The killer was standing at the edge of the mahogany table, less than 3 feet from where Elias cowered. What Elias didn't know in that pitch-black eternity was that predators hunting in the dark don't rely on sight. They rely on panic. They wait for their prey to break cover. The entity standing above him wasn't blind. It was listening to the house. A terrifying, leathery creak echoed above Elias's head as the killer shifted its grip on the axe handle. Wham! The explosion of sound was catastrophic. The killer brought the flat, heavy iron head of the axe smashing down onto the top of the table with godless force. The thick wood violently shuddered, sending a shower of century-old dust raining down onto Elias's neck. The impact vibrated straight into his bones. It was a test, a brutal tactic designed to make whoever was hiding beneath the wood scream or flinch. Elias bit down on his own finger so hard he tasted metallic blood. A strangled whimper fought to tear its way out of his throat, but he swallowed it, burying his face deeper into his knees. He didn't move a single muscle. He simply let the dust settle over him in the terrifying dark. For 10 agonizing seconds, there was nothing but that wet, rattling breathing from above. The killer was listening for the aftermath of the strike. Slowly, the heavy leather boots shifted. The iron axe head slid off the table and hit the floorboards with a dull thud. Shh. 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 The deliberate drag of the weapon resumed, but to Elias's profound relief, the sound began to move away. The killer was navigating around the massive table, lumbering toward the open archway leading into the kitchen. The suffocating smell of copper trailed after it, gradually lessening in the heat. Elias waited until the dragging sound crossed the threshold and grew muffled. His lungs burned with a desperate agony. He slowly released his bite on his finger and took a shallow, trembling breath. He couldn't stay under the table. Once the killer finished sweeping the kitchen, it would inevitably return. Elias needed to move. The front door was locked. The windows were boarded with iron nails. There was only one place in the house he hadn't checked for a way out, the very place the nightmare had originated from. To survive, Elias had to go up the pitch-black stairs. He had to go into the attic.
Elias waited until the heavy, dragging shk of the iron axe faded completely into the stifling confines of the kitchen. The stagnant, oven-like heat of the dining room felt marginally less oppressive without the suffocating stench of raw copper and old sweat choking the air. Slowly, agonizingly, he untangled his trembling limbs and crawled out from beneath the shattered mahogany table. The darkness was absolute. It was a physical weight pressing against his eyes, disorienting and total. He extended a shaking hand, his fingertips brushing the dry, peeling wallpaper of the dining room archway. He had to rely entirely on spatial memory to navigate back to the main hallway. One wrong step, one blindly kicked floorboard, and the predator in the kitchen would instantly pivot. He shuffled forward, sliding his boots millimeters at a time. The silence in the house was a fragile, terrifying membrane, waiting to be violently punctured. From the kitchen, a faint metallic clatter echoed. The killer was overturning something heavy, searching the dark. Elias reached the foyer. The splintered ruins of the heavy oak front door dug jaggedly into his shoulder as he felt his way past it. He stood at the base of the impossibly steep, narrow wooden staircase, the very stairs the nightmare had originally descended. We often think of escape as moving away from the source of our terror.
What Elias had to do, what pure, desperate survival demanded, was to crawl directly into the beast's lair. He had to climb into the sweltering, claustrophobic attic, praying to find a rotting roof hatch or a loose window board that the heavy iron nails hadn't fully secured. He placed his right boot onto the first wooden tread. He tested his weight. The century-old pine held silent. He shifted upward. The ascent in the pitch black was a slow, agonizing exercise in sensory deprivation. Elias kept his hands pressed flat against the narrow walls on either side, using them as physical guides as he blindly climbed. The air grew perceptibly hotter with every step. By the time he reached the midway point, the atmosphere was suffocating, a thick, dry heat that smelled of baked dust and trapped decay. Sweat stung his eyes, completely useless in the void. Creak. The sound was minuscule, but to Elias's hyper-vigilant ears it sounded like a gunshot. His left boot had found a weak spot on the 8th step. He froze entirely, his lungs seizing. He clamped his eyes shut, listening intently to the floor below. For 3 terrifying seconds, there was nothing. Then, from the kitchen, the heavy dragging abruptly stopped. The metallic clatter ceased. The killer had heard it. Panic, raw and blinding, threatened to overwhelm Elias's precarious balance on the steep stairs. He abandoned stealth. He threw himself upward, scrambling up the remaining wooden steps on his hands and knees, desperate to reach the second-floor landing before the heavy, rhythmic footfalls reached the foyer. He hit the top landing just as a monstrous, shattering crash echoed from below. The killer had charged out of the kitchen, the heavy iron axe violently striking the doorframe in its haste. Step, clack, drag. The rhythm was back, but it was frantic now, fast, violent. The entity was rushing toward the base of the stairs. Elias scrambled blindly down the second-floor hallway. The air up here was an absolute furnace. He felt his hands smack against a low, slanted wooden door, the entrance to the attic space. He fumbled frantically for the latch. It was thick, rusted iron, burning hot to the touch in the stagnant air. Behind him, the first heavy footfall struck the bottom stair. The ancient wood screamed in protest under the immense weight. Step, clack, drag. Elias shoved the heavy iron latch upward. It resisted, grating loudly against the housing. The killer was on the 3rd step. The foul, sickly sweet smell of raw copper and sweat was already drafting up the narrow stairwell, riding the heat wave. With a final desperate heave, he threw his entire weight against the wood. The attic door gave way, spilling him forward into a sweltering, pitch-black oven, just as the heavy drag of the iron axe reached the midway point of the stairs behind him.
The attic was a pitch-black furnace. The stagnant, oven-like heat hit Elias like a physical wall as he spilled across the uneven floorboards. Century-old dust plumed into the suffocating air, violently coating his throat. He scrambled backward in the dark, throwing his entire weight against the slanted wooden door he had just breached. He fumbled desperately for the heavy iron latch, slamming it down just as the dreadful rhythm reached the second-floor landing. Step, clack, drag. The sound stopped perfectly flush with the thin wood of the attic door. Through the century-old pine, Elias could hear the wet, rattling bellows of the killer's lungs. The sickening stench of sour sweat and raw copper seeped through the cracks, thicker and more nauseating than ever before. What Elias didn't know in that terrifying dark, what his arrogant research had completely missed, was that the attic was where the 1912 butcher had originally hidden, waiting patiently for the family to fall asleep. Elias hadn't just climbed into a trap, he had cornered himself in the predator's nest. Elias backed away on all fours, his palms sliding in the thick dust until his back hit the sharply angled pitch of the roof. He reached up blindly, his raw fingers finding a small gable window. It was sealed shut with thick wooden planks and heavy iron nails. Wham! The heavy iron axe head bit violently through the center of the attic door. Jagged splinters of ancient wood showered across Elias's boots. The entire frame buckled inward. Panic completely overrode his exhaustion. Elias tore at the rotting planks covering the window. The sweltering heat had softened the century-old wood. He dug his bloody fingernails under the edge of the first board and ripped backward. The rusted iron shrieked in protest. Crack, splinter! The attic door gave way entirely, blasted completely off its rusted hinges. The hulking, terrifying silhouette forced its massive frame into the cramped, sweltering space. The darkness here was absolute, but Elias could feel the immense kinetic shift in the air as the killer raised the heavy iron axe in the confined quarters. Elias planted both boots flat against the remaining wooden boards and kicked with every ounce of his adrenaline-fueled strength. The wood exploded outward. A sudden rush of cool, stormy August air and faint starlight flooded the attic, temporarily blinding him. He didn't hesitate. As the terrifying whoosh of displaced air signaled the axe swinging down towards his skull, Elias threw his entire body through the jagged, splintered opening. The heavy iron wedge buried itself deeply into the wooden sill with a deafening thud, mere millimeters from Elias's trailing boot. Elias plummeted 2 stories into the overgrown thorny bushes below. The impact shattered his collarbone and fractured 3 ribs, but he didn't stop. He dragged his broken body through the suffocating humidity of the cornfields for 3 agonizing miles until a passing truck found him staggering down the highway, covered in blood and century-old dust. Elias Thorne survived the Miller farmhouse, but the true horror of his ordeal wasn't the shattered bones or the physical scars. It was the aftermath. When the local authorities finally breached the heavy oak front door the following morning, the house was utterly empty. There was no hulking figure, no blood, no footprints in the thick dust of the foyer, but Elias's primary audio deck, left behind in the parlor, had captured it all. If you listen to Elias's final recording, past the chaotic screams of splintering wood and his desperate plunge into the night, the farmhouse eventually returns to its suffocating, dead silence. But right before the battery dies, if you crank the gain dial all the way up, you can hear it bleeding through the ceiling from the sweltering attic above. Tap, tap, tap. The patient, rhythmic sound of heavy iron against wood, waiting in the dark for the next time the deadbolt slides shut.